What will Destiny's next subclass be? Let's take a look at the history of Destiny's elemental subclasses and potential hints we've seen recently to try and predict what form the next new subclass will take. Elemental subclasses are an integral part of Destiny's identity. They are expressions of paracausal forces, forces that have the ability to overwrite the causal laws of nature, a form of magic. In Vanilla Destiny 1, the three classes, Warlock, Titan, and Hunter, each had two subclasses, corresponding to one of the three paracausal light elements, Void, Solar, and Arc. Void and Solar Warlock, Arc and Void Titan, and Solar and Arc Hunter. The Taken King expansion gave each class their missing element, Arc Warlock, Solar Titan, and Void Hunter. For 5 years afterwards, this was the status quo. There were 3 elemental subclasses that each class had access to. They would occasionally get new abilities or supers, but the overarching subclasses stayed the same. However, in Beyond Light, the status quo changed as Guardians started using paracausal darkness. Each class got a 4th subclass, Stasis. This was a major paradigm shift because it introduced the idea of adding additional subclasses beyond the 3 light elements. The community immediately coalesced around the idea that we needed 3 darkness subclasses to balance the light and pay off the underlying theme of symmetry that pervades the second half of the Light and Darkness saga. In Lightfall, the 5th element was introduced, Strand. This left a final darkness subclass to complete the set of 6, so everyone was expecting to see this in final shape, the conclusion to the Light and Darkness saga. However, in that expansion, Bungie threw us a curveball by introducing Prismatic, a 6th subclass that wasn't a unique element, and instead served as the fusion of light and darkness, by incorporating a subset of abilities from each of the 5 existing subclasses. People who crave symmetry still want a 3rd darkness subclass, so that there will be an equal number of light and darkness elements and abilities to choose from. There's also a mural in Rolk's Pyramid in the Preservation mission that shows what appears to be 3 colors representing the darkness. Blue for Stasis, green for Strand, and a yellow one in the middle. However, it's possible the yellow just represents Resonance, the darkness power Rolk and many other Pyramid Fleet bosses wield, but it's also possible it represents the 3rd darkness subclass. When pondering this mural, Rolk reflects upon the destruction of Lubre and says,
"I keep this mural not as some worthless sentimental reminder of what I lost, but of the opposite, of what I gained. Power. Truth of the inconsequence of most. Control over the universal strings of fate. For all this, I am eternally grateful, my witness."
Rolk is obviously talking about the darkness and how it as a paracausal force gives people control of their fate by usurping the causal laws of nature, reinforcing the idea that the mural is depicting the darkness. Perhaps we will get a 3rd darkness subclass after all. However, in the time since Final Shape, the story has moved beyond the paracausal conflict between light and darkness and into a new paradigm, the Fate Saga, which is focused on the 9. Players still want new subclasses and abilities to play with, but it's unclear when we will get them, and if the next one will still be a darkness subclass or something new. The 9 are set up as a 3rd power separate from light and darkness. This is made most explicit in the Sintering lorebook. When Bale communes with 6 of the 9 for the first time, he remarks, "This was not the light. It was not even the darkness. This was a 3rd power, a new thing." It appears that the Fate Saga will be focused on how the 9 function as a 3rd power, separate from the paracausal forces of light and darkness. The Edge of Fate and Renegades have already begun to play with the idea of the 9 as a counterweight to the paracausal forces. Prior to the launch of each new subclass, we've seen subtle hints towards what it will be. Completing the 3 light elements was obvious in Vanilla Destiny. In Shadowkeep, the expansion prior to Beyond Light, Eris Morn touches a darkness artifact, and it turns blue, seeming to freeze. This teased Stasis a year ahead of its release. Strand wasn't teased much prior to its reveal, but we can see iconography similar to it in some Witch Queen designs. Instead, Witch Queen focused on reworking the existing light subclasses into the aspect and fragment system Stasis used to pave the way for Prismatic. Lightfall launched with Conditional Finality, an exotic shotgun that alternates between firing solar and stasis energy. The final shape pre-order bonus exotic Tessellation changes element depending on your equipped grenade. These weapons teased Prismatic in the year leading up to its reveal in the spring of 2024. This leads community theorists to latch on to anything that could be interpreted as teasing a new subclass, for hints at the next one. There even was a red subclass that was supposedly leaked during Lightfall, but was later confirmed by Bungie to be fake. A central facet of each subclass is its color. Each existing subclass has used a different color to distinguish its energy type. This is useful design to help communicate to players that they're distinct forces. Void is purple, Solar is orange, and Arc is cyan or light blue. Stasis is indigo or dark blue. Strand is green, and Prismatic is pink. This leaves red, yellow, black, gray, and white as compelling options for a future subclass color. The community has latched on to red in particular because of that fake leak, and because it's not been used for paracausal energy very much in Destiny, with the exception of the nightmares from the Lunar Pyramid. Let's investigate the candidates for a subclass and see how likely they are. The contender that's gotten the most buzz recently is Eclipse. This is because it's a new type of energy we've never seen before, that's red, and has a prominent focus in Renegades. For people convinced the next subclass will be red, it seems like a compelling option. Eclipse is introduced with a bang. The Barrent Imperium uses an Eclipse weapon, Nightfall Station, to kill dozens of Guardians.
We've ended the lives of dozens of guardians and ghosts on Tarsus. Nightfall has nullified their light.
In a later mission, Bale explains what happened.
What you saw at Tarsus was a demonstration of Eclipse energy. It negates paracausal power completely. A perfect, targeted, bloodless kill.
From Bale, we learn that Eclipse energy is an anti-paracausal force that has the ability to nullify paracausal forces. I've heard Eclipse called anti-causal, but I don't really like that as a descriptor, and I prefer anti-paracausal, because paracausal forces are also inherently anti-causal. Eclipse is specifically anti-paracausal, not anti-causal. In fact, you could say that because Eclipse isn't paracausal, it's more causal than anti-causal. I'm ultimately being very pedantic about this, but some people might care. In another cutscene, Six confirms he gave Bale the station core, helping establish that the Nine's third power is not paracausal like light or darkness. Instead, their powers are distinct and interact with paracausal forces in new ways. This tells us that instead of the chiral light versus darkness paradigm from the previous saga, we're now looking at a para versus anti-paracausal conflict. This then leads me to wonder, if we're moving beyond light and darkness in the Fate Saga, will the Guardian obtain an anti-paracausal subclass? Believers of the Eclipse subclass theory think so. However, there's a bit more about Eclipse we have to look at to get the full picture. In the final mission of Renegades, when the Guardian fights Premier Loom, he says something that I find insightful.
Eclipse is anathema to you, but it fuels my cuirass, and with it, I will crush you.
This connects to a line from Sintering which explains more explicitly what Loom means. Bale writes, "Loom bellowed in my aurals, screaming at me in fury for the death of his brethren. He swore to kill me when I returned, but I knew he would not. So I told him, and I began to laugh and made him another promise. I would heal his wound, erase the hive magic that rotted him from the inside out." Through 6, Bale uses Eclipse to heal Loom from the hive corruption that has been destroying him. We see here that Eclipse can potentially be used as a tool for good. It can negate the effects of hive magic, healing Loom from a paracausal infection. However, it remains anathema to the Guardian and all Lightbearers, as contact will kill them. Lodi reaches out to the Guardian and shares his experience of the attack.
Guardian, the Nightfall attack. I felt it from Earth. It's like the fourth dimension reached out, grabbed the gas knob, and turned it off.
This gives us a salient metaphor for what Eclipse does to paracausal forces. It takes the gas that powers the flame and cuts its source, depriving it of fuel, causing it to extinguish. Without that fuel, paracausality cannot function, and is thus negated. While searching for survivors of the attack on Tharsis, the Guardian examines the corpse of a Lightbearer and determines Dredgen Bale's orbital weapon has shorn this Guardian's paracausal soul apart. You sense no light within this body. This explains why Eclipse kills Guardians. It cancels out the paracausal light of the Traveler that allows them to resurrect after death, and reverts them to that earlier state, the death they had before their ghost resurrected them and gave them the light. This raises interesting questions about the metaphysics of Guardians and ghosts. In the final shape via Cade's resurrection, we learn there's a kind of afterlife, where a Guardian's light is rejoined in union with the Traveler. You can think of it as their paracausal soul returning to the Traveler after their death. Cade is ripped from this state and gains a short-second life through Crow's wish to Riven. He returns to the Traveler again by sacrificing his light to resurrect Ghost in the Excision cutscene. Eclipse rendering the paracausal souls from the bodies of Guardians makes me wonder if they're able to rejoin the Traveler, or if they're wiped out completely with no possibility of entering that afterlife. I would guess it's the latter, but it's currently unclear. In a recent interview with Destiny narrative director Allison Lurs, My Name is Bife asked her about this line. Allison provides some clarity about the intentions behind it. I don't think we want to get into like the metaphysics of, does a soul exist in Destiny? Instead, this is kind of a shorthand way of saying that the juice has been squeezed. There is nothing left here because it was affected by this. I'm kinda glad that Allison dodges the metaphysics, because it leaves room for theorizing and interpretation about the nature of Guardian souls and their afterlife. To me, it seems likely that some sort of metaphysical soul of light exists within the hearts of Guardians, given Cade's description of his experience in the final shape, but I can understand wanting to leave that ambiguous and open to debate, as it allows Destiny to reflect the situation in the real world, where different religions have different interpretations on the metaphysics of the soul and the afterlife. It seems unlikely to me that Guardians could wield Eclipse, as it would remove their light and kill them, or at the very least negate it, preventing them from ever using it again. That doesn't seem like something we could wield the same way as a lighter Darkness subclass to me. I could see us fashioning our own Eclipse weapons, but that's about as far as I see that going unless there's a different form of Eclipse that wouldn't actually kill a Lightbearer. Shortly after the attack, Blue decrypts the plans for Nightfall Station and expands upon Eclipse's capabilities.
Nightfall Station doesn't just have a light-killing payload. Theoretically, it nullifies the darkness as well.
This establishes that Eclipse has the power to negate any paracausal force, light or darkness. However, Bale taunts Zavala, saying that Eclipse cannot kill him because he's lost his ghost.
After all, the Nightfall weapon will not hurt you. Not anymore.
This means that someone who uses the darkness but doesn't have a ghost isn't killed by Eclipse. Their ability to use the darkness would be negated, but since they don't have the paracausal soul granted by their ghost anymore, they're not killed completely. This is interesting because it indicates a fundamental difference between light bearers and dark bearers. Having a ghost is something very special indeed. My Name is Bife asks Allison about this in his interview, and she explains. One of the big questions that we had that we wanted to address with the 9 is, what do they do? Like, what's the function of the 9? And one of the early ideas that we had and things that made sense was the 9 are laws. They are the rules. Those rules extend out to all of the physical forces in our galaxy, including the forces that enable the effect of paracausality. The 9 cannot use paracausality themselves. They are not paracausal. That will always be true. But what they are is they enable the conditions that paracausality can thrive. And those conditions can be turned all the way up and they can be turned all the way down. And what Eclipse is it is a negation of the conditions that enable paracausality, which is fatal when aimed at a paracausal being like a guardian or a ghost. If we were to aim that at an average person on the street who's using darkness, for example, they'd probably be fine, but they also probably wouldn't feel great. But they wouldn't die because they aren't inherently paracausal the same way that a guardian is. We can kind of think of it like the 9 are the hand on the knob of the gas stove that are able to turn it up and down, but they can't make the flame that ignites the stovetop. This helpfully expands upon Lodi's metaphor, explaining the exact mechanism by which the 9's anti-paracausal powers affect paracausality. They can turn the knob up and make the conditions more favorable for paracausal forces, like the Inners must have done in order to entice the Traveler to come to Sol, as explained in The Edge of Fate. Or they can turn the knob down, negating paracausality completely through Eclipse energy, as 6 enables Bale to do via Nightfall Station. The static data shell contains a message from 7, who discusses Eclipse in the same terms Allison does. Eclipse, our nature to nurture and negate, higher dimensional skill set, death of a witness, Queen of Lies, Eclipse, Red Brother returns, Red Sands reform, dark matter in its bones, its soul reflects, paracausality while beyond reach must obey elemental laws, and those laws are the soul's very foundation, always within reach. The ontology of the vanishing has been rejected, and thus, the Red Valleys reinstantiate. The soul of Mars speaks to the inner orbits. This describes what I believe is the 9's first test of Eclipse. They see the Witness take planets from Sol into the Ascendant Plane, including Mars, but the 9 want their planets back, so they devise a scheme. 4 uses Eclipse on the shadow of Mars that remains while it's in the Ascendant Plane. Under this interpretation, Mars returns through the intervention of the 9, using Eclipse to wrench it from the Ascendant Plane. The time anomalies on the planet are likely remnants of both time in the Ascendant Plane and the 9's influence, pulling memories from the past into the present. However, it's also possible that this is describing Mars returning through Savathun's knowledge of the Ascendant Plane and Hive magic, causing the 9 to take notice and develop Eclipse based on what 4 observes. Either way, one of the 2 parties controls the gas knob to negate paracausality, returning Mars to Sol. This could also explain how Titan returned in Season of the Deep, through 6 using Eclipse. Additionally, it makes me wonder if 5 and 1 could return Mercury and Io from the Ascendant Plane using Eclipse, why they haven't done so yet. Do they have ulterior motives and reasons to want their planets to stay gone just a bit longer? All of this implies we will see the 9 tinker with the conditions of Sol, encouraging or discouraging paracausal forces, as they try to change the future of Sol. It also further further explains how they are able to change the fates of paracausal beings. They can tinker with the underlying conditions to nudge the wielder of paracausal forces towards a desired outcome. Perhaps next time you whiff your golden gun or nova bomb, you can blame the Nines tinkering with the knob. Eclipse seems to be the state of the knob when it's turned to be most hostile towards paracausality, negating it completely, but that implies the existence of an opposite state, a kind of pro-paracausal energy that magnifies our paracausal forces, allowing them to reach their zenith instead of eclipsing them. As we saw after the Nightfall Station attack, Eclipse kills lightbearers who come into contact with it. However, it's less clear what it does to a powerful darkbearer. I would imagine that Eclipse would have killed the Witness given it's a paracausal being, created by merging billions of conscious minds in darkness. It's less clear what effect it would have on someone who has a throne world in the Ascendant Plane, but my guess would be that it would at the very least cut their connection to it, making them mortal, if not killing them outright, as throne worlds are inherently paracausal. It's viscerally obvious how we would use Eclipse to kill other lightbearers, but it seems like it wouldn't be very helpful for fighting our enemies who are not inherently paracausal, given it would have little effect on them. Thus, I think that rather than an Eclipse subclass, it's far more likely if we get a subclass from the 9, that it will be either a subclass that promotes paracausality rather than negates it, or they will enable us to discover a new paracausal subclass by encouraging paracausality. It's unclear how a pro-paracausal subclass would differ from something like Prismatic, though. Maybe it could give us transcendence-like effects on already existing subclasses or new supers. We could discover the third Darkness subclass, perhaps the yellow one, after the 9 turn the gas knob way up for us, making it easier to access paracausal forces. If we get a third Darkness subclass, I actually think it's not out of the question at this point for it to be a taken subclass. I still think this is relatively unlikely, but there is some new evidence in the Equilibrium dungeon. The mechanics involve a black taken ability that looks like a subclass ability and takes the place of your grenade. This is a little strange given that it's basically a force push ability, which would make sense as a melee, but I'm pretty sure the reason for that is they wanted people to be able to do the mechanics while wielding the Praxic Blade, which would override any melee abilities. Heresy narratively featured the Guardian learning more taken powers, and the Echo of Navigation calls them heir presumptive of the Taken Throne. In addition to conflict with the Lord of Every Nothing being set up in Heresy, and Bale's Dredgens wielding Taken power, it seems likely the Guardian will delve further into Taken power than we have before in the future. If we were going to have a Taken subclass, there's an ability from Rise of Iron that I want to mention as a candidate. One of the artifacts that you can unlock after completing the campaign allows you to turn enemies friendly and attack other enemies by meleeing them. I could see this being repurposed to allow us to take an enemy and turn them against their allies by taking them. Other than what I've already mentioned, the subclass would probably be themed around blights, shadows, knives, dark magic, and compelling combatants to do things against their will. However, I think this subclass is unlikely mainly because it seems quite difficult to come up with enough workable abilities and verbs that feel taken-y to support a whole subclass, but I wanted to mention it as a possibility. It's one of those ideas that's been floating around the community for years, like the Poison subclass themed around weapons of sorrow and hive magic, or the Nightmare subclass based on the Lunar Pyramid. I think both of these are substantially less likely than a Taken subclass, because there's essentially no evidence for them existing aside from that enemies have used the darkness in that way already. People have also talked about a Kinetic subclass for years. Originally, I wasn't a believer, but once I thought about it, it started making more and more sense, to the point where I now think it's a non-zero possibility. Let me lay out the evidence for you. Bungie has slowly been introducing and standardizing kinetic verbs, particularly in 2025. First, they made the distinction between blinding grenade launchers and arc blind by changing the name of blinding GLs to disorienting GLs in Lightfall. This also coincided with the introduction of kinetic tremors and its shockwave effect to give kinetic weapons a unique splash perk. Things were quiet for the next 2 years until episode Heresy, when Bungie standardized Exhaust as a kinetic verb for enemy outgoing damage reduction. They also introduced a kinetic frag grenade in the Nether as a boon. Then, in Edge of Fate, they converted micro-missiles into a standard generic effect by changing rocket sidearms to be considered micro-missile frames, alongside introducing a second micro-missile grenade launcher, Theodolite, and micro-missile pulse rifles. Alongside this, kinetic was a focus in the artifact, and 2 new kinetic weapon perks were introduced that made use of disorient and micro-missiles. Bewildering Burst creates disorienting explosions, and Ancillary Ordnance charges up micro-missiles on non-micro-missile frame weapons. Renegades continued this trend by introducing 2 more kinetic perks, Adhesive Ordnance, which makes use of Exhaust, and Stopping Power, which staggers combatants. All of these changes amount to a kinetic 3.0 of sorts for weapons. It makes me suspicious that all of this standardization is to prepare for a kinetic subclass. The only problem with this idea is that subclasses tend to be paracausal, and kinetic is a causal effect, not a paracausal one. However, the Eclipse and the pro-paracausal subclasses are also not paracausal, so maybe the fabled kinetic subclass isn't out of the question anymore, now that we've moved beyond light and darkness. The kinetic subclass would be focused on concussing enemies, accelerating objects, explosions, and metal. Existing kinetic abilities include base class melees, the frag grenade, and base class abilities. I've already mentioned the existing kinetic verbs, disorient, exhaust, stagger, and micro-missiles. That really only leaves kinetic aspects, fragments, and supers. It's easy to imagine kinetic fragments based on the existing suite of kinetic verbs and perks, but I have no idea what aspects and supers would look like. I wasn't a believer in the kinetic subclass idea until I thought about the potential narrative reason for its existence. What if the 9 used some kind of anti-paracausal ability on the Guardian that doesn't kill us but takes away our paracausal abilities? Then we could use kinetic abilities until we got our paracausal abilities back. It would be kinda like losing the light in the Red War, but more substantial, where we lose access to all abilities except the kinetic subclass. Bungie has mentioned considering a kinetic subclass in the past, but one has never seen the light of day. In a 2023 TWID, they publicly mused about finding ways to address kinetic weapons falling behind other damage types, including joking about a subclass, and mentioned they were working on stuff for the final shape, which is likely what led to the kinetic verbs we now have. Perhaps Bungie may resurrect this idea in the future and make it real. It's a bit of a stretch, but isn't completely out of the question at this point. I've saved what I think is the most compelling idea I have for last. My idea for a 3rd Darkness subclass. I've been thinking about how potential 3rd Darkness subclasses could tie thematically into the Fate Saga. The main thing I came up with is some kind of time-based subclass, playing up the Darkness's connection to memory, the 9's manipulation of time, and the idea of fate. The core idea would be altering the flow of time for objects and enemies, slowing, speeding up, pausing, or reversing time for them. We saw a version of this happen due to the 9's anti-paracausal effects, as Drifter is aged during the Edge of Fate cutscene. Stopping time for an enemy would be similar to stasis freeze, except without the ability of the combatant to break out, as time is paused for them. You could deal damage to them during the pause time. This would probably only happen in short bursts, to avoid it being completely overpowered. Reversing time could have the effect of altering the enemy's physics, launching them away. Speeding up time could age the enemy, and if it reached a certain stat count, they would die of old age. It could also launch them by applying forces to them over a short amount of time, kinda like a wind ability, or applying anti-gravity to them, making them float into the sky. Slowing time would be similar to stasis slow. It could slow their movement while also reducing their damage output because they move more slowly. I could see this subclass narratively tying into the Nine's time abilities as a way for the Guardian to thwart the Nine using paracausal abilities to subvert chronal flow. You could also use this subclass to explain the Exo-Stranger's time loop, a paracausal form of time manipulation via the darkness. The main issue with this idea is it might be too similar to stasis thematically, which is about controlling entropy and would have similar effects to a time manipulation subclass. Since I pulled this idea out of my ass based on the Edge of Fate ending cutscene and the lore about the Nine manipulating time, I think it's not super likely, but I think it's a cool idea. If a third Darkness subclass is introduced, I think select abilities from it should be added to Prismatic to round out the kit, allowing Prismatic to access one ability of each type for every Light and Darkness subclass. That's pretty much all the ideas I have. I still think a third Darkness subclass of some form is more likely than any of the other options like Kinetic or Eclipse. As displayed with Strand and Prismatic, Bungie likes to surprise the community and doesn't want to give us the subclasses we expect, so I'm guessing whatever it ends up being is something the community won't see coming, but will make a lot of sense in retrospect. Let me know in the comments what you think of the potential future subclass ideas, and share any of your own. If you want to support the creation of future videos, you can subscribe, or consider becoming a channel member. I recently overhauled the perks for my channel membership offerings, so take a peek at them by clicking the join button if that's something you're interested in. As always, regardless of whether you're a first-time viewer or long-time channel member, thank you to everyone for watching.